Hi YouTube and Blade Forums, John here again. Today I'm here to review the Spyderco Sage 3 in carbon fiber. This is a carbon fiber laminated G10 handle carrying a CPM S30V blade steel. This knife is 7.3 inches overall. Closed, the blade is 4.2 inches. The blade length is 3 inches. Okay, and the thickness of the blade is 0.118 inches and the weight is 3.2 ounces. Now this Sage is unique among the other Sage models. This one here has a slightly longer usable edge length, about 1/10 of an inch longer approximately, and the height of the blade is actually about 1/10 of an inch higher as well. So overall, this thing is destined to be a better slicer with the thinner blade stock, the slower taper to the top, and a slightly longer usable edge length. It's an excellent slicer, and in my test I've had incredible results. I got 1,050 cuts on 3/8 inch sisal rope. It more than doubled the results of the S35 VN on the ZT450. So on the handle here we have the laminated G10, which has the carbon fiber laminate on here. Okay, you have the wire clip, which is an amazing clip design. It holds in the pocket firm. It doesn't ever slide out. I've had no problems with pocket retention on here. But also one of the nice benefits of this is it's not a paint scratcher on your car. Okay, it's also not something that's going to scratch your leather couch. So it's something that if you forget you're wearing it, you don't have to worry about damaging things as much as you do with, say, your typical clip here, which can dig into things. Okay, so on the knife it has a closed back design, as you can see here. It's not an open. Okay, so you have a G10 spacer going along the whole back end here. Okay, the fit and finish is just excellent though. It's impeccable really. You can't differentiate the handle scale from the G10 spacer on here. You have to look very closely with the right light to actually even see a semblance of a seam. Okay, and on the knife here, the locking mechanism is the Blackie Collins bolt lock. The bolt lock functions basically like a Benchmade access lock. Okay, you have one hand closed and opened, except it's a little more difficult to disengage than the access lock because there's a little more spring tension. So when you first get this, at least when I did, it really dug into my thumb and my finger. And you can still see indentations on there, but I'm used to it now, and it's broken in, so it's a lot easier than it used to be. Also on here, the blade retention isn't quite as good as on the Benchmades, so you may want to tighten down your pivot possibly depending on how you carry this thing, because this will open up by flicking your wrist. So I would not suggest carrying this just loose in your pocket. You want to keep it clipped and make sure the blade goes against the seam of your pocket. Okay, so the lock works differently. Instead of having just a bar that goes back and forth on the knife blade like this, okay, that's like how the access lock does it. This one has a bolt, okay, and it wedges in between the top of the tang and the stop pin. So kind of like a compression lock, except that you're retracting it by pulling it back instead of flipping over a lever there. Okay, it has a pretty good sized stop pin here. So overall, it's a very strong lock. I'd say probably one of the strongest locks out there. There's absolutely zero blade play in this thing. It's really nice. And if you can see on here, you have bolts on both sides here. Okay. Now this is the CPM S30V steel. This thing is a slicer. This thing is just an amazing slicer. The edge is so very thin at the front here, and it tapers up so gradually to the top, more gradually than I've seen on any other knife so far. Part of it is just because it's a nice grind, but also because the blade is so tall. And so that just makes for an excellent cutter. But it also brings me to my most critical point on this knife, and that is how wide it is. This thing is to me, it's just way too wide. It doesn't carry nicely in the pocket. It takes up all the room. I can't fit my hand in my pocket when this knife is in the front pocket. Okay, it sits nice and deep, so it's not visible to people who are just walking by, and with this kind of clip it can pass off as a pen almost, but it's so wide in the pocket you can't really keep anything else in there. So when I do carry this, which is not very often unfortunately because of how wide it is, I tend to carry it in my back pocket, because that way, you know, there's nothing else in there and I don't put my hand back there except to pull the knife out. But yeah, you can see me gripping here. It's uncomfortable. If you're just holding your knife until the next time you cut something, like you're in between cuts, it's not comfortable to hold because it's so wide. And I wear medium-sized gloves. My hands aren't tiny, you know, but they're not large either. So if you have larger hands, it might not be as much of an issue for you, but you're going to definitely notice it when comparing to, say, this Benchmade here. Okay, you see the difference on the size of these knives here, okay? Alright, and then check out your Delica even. The Delica is a lot smaller than this even. If you can see the difference there, it's quite substantial, especially on the front end here. So this is just a big knife, but that's what gives it its excellent cutting performance. Okay. Now, as far as ergonomics go, this knife is one of the most comfortable knives I've handled. It fits your hand like a glove, it really does, and your thumb just goes right to that thumb ramp. You can use a choil or not, but it's a very comfortable grip in your standard type grip and like this. Where it's not as good is when you say like when you're peeling an apple, because it's hard to grip here because the handle's a little on the wide side. But in your standard grip, it's probably the most comfortable knife you can have that I've experienced so far, and if you're doing a lot of just regular cutting with it, slicing, it's going to be a very good knife to have. It's going to do the job very well. Now, as far as maintenance goes, because even though this is SRDV and it can be difficult to sharpen for some people, because the edge is so thin, you don't have to remove very much metal to get a sharp edge again. In fact, with about maybe 5 passes on each side with Spyderco fine ceramic, I can bring back a sharp edge. And then 2 passes on each side with a loaded strop, and it's a razor sharp screaming edge. So, but because of the width of the blade, like I said, it's a good slicer, but sometimes it's not a good cutter. It cuts through things really well. It cuts through rope quickly because it has an excellent blade shape. It's kind of a constant curve almost, and that makes it push through the material a lot easier because you're putting more pressure on any one point. However, if you're going in for a tight cut, like say you have this little loop here, okay, 1/3 of a piece of sisal rope. You see how small that loop is? You see how I can't really get into there? I can only get that far. So you can still cut that, it just makes it a lot harder. And you see how the blade kind of slides off on there, because I can't get in all the way. Whereas if I take the same loop here now, and let me use my valet here because this is sharp. You can see how I can get in there all the way, okay? And let me show you a Delica, just your regular full flat ground. I can get halfway up to Delica, so that's going to give you a lot more room to actually slide this through and cut it, okay? So that's, to me, that's one of the minor downfalls, and because of that, you know, I remove a fraction of a point off of the cutting performance for that. But as far as sharpness goes, it gets very sharp, and it takes a really nice edge. It cuts through this paper towel no problem. You have your piece of phone book paper everyone likes to cut. Slices through nice and easy. And I've already done several cuts with this through rope now, okay? Here's envelope duty. You can see it just cuts right through there. It's a nice clean cut. So, next we have some cardboard here. Just a little thin piece. But you can see, watch how easily it cuts through here, and listen to the sound too. There's barely any resistance on there. It really just goes right through, you know. And look how I can cut these up. I can cut this without crushing the cardboard, if you can see that there. Okay, so that is really nice. Let me show you cutting through a rope here so you can see how it cuts through, how it pushes through when it's going for it. Okay, so that cutting through that rope right there takes less pressure than it does on most of the knives I use, and that's just because it's so thin right behind the edge. So if you're looking for a knife that's a great slicer, it's hard for me to think of something that's better than this. Okay, so that brings me to the end here, and this is the review I gave to it. These are the points I assigned to it. For the carrying of the knife in the pocket, the drawing of the knife, and the deployment of the knife, I give it a 2. Basically almost as low as you can go. Carrying it in the pocket is just awful. I don't like it. And if it carried better, I would be carrying this knife a lot more. But because of how wide it is in the pocket, I've just never carried it very much. And maybe only a couple dozen times total in the last year. But the only thing that's keeping it from getting a 0 or a 1 on this is the fact that the clip retention is very good in the pocket. It doesn't slide out. And because it carries deep and it has just the perfect amount of tension on the clip, you're not going to lose this knife very easily. It's not going to slide out of your pocket in a restaurant booth. Okay, like I've lost 3 Kershaws that way a long time ago. But this clip is nice, and like I said, it doesn't cut paint, it doesn't cut your couch. So it's really nice for that. And as far as deployment is good because it works like an access lock basically. And you can even deploy this with gloves on. And that's what keeps it from having a 0 or a 1 on that rating there, okay? Slicer, perfect 5. Best slicer I've ever handled in my life. Amazing slicer. I can't imagine finding something better than this. This is just, it's incredible. When I did the sisal rope cut test, let me just show you. This thing just sliced through here like it wasn't even there. I mean, it was like I was cutting through air. It was just incredible. Listen to the sound. So if you hear that, that's just clean. And for that reason, this guy gets a 5 out of 5. Perfect 5 out of 5 on the slicing ability. I gave the 940-1 a 3.5 and I gave the Valet a 4. This is just by and large superior, okay? Ergonomics, I gave it a 4. In your standard grip, like I said, it's like almost as good as you can get. When you're whittling a stick, this actually works really well. On the Delica, okay, sorry, I cut out there. On the Delica, when I whittle a stick, my thumb, it really digs into this thumb ramp here. You can see how steep the thumb ramp is on the Delica compared to here. This one has a much shallower thumb ramp. And for that reason, when you're whittling a piece of stick or you're really bearing down on something, it doesn't dig into your thumb and hurt like the Delica can sometimes. So for ergonomic wise, this thing is amazing. The only thing that keeps it from getting a perfect 5 is when you have to hold it this way. So if you're trying to peel an apple, or say if you're an electrician or you're doing something with the electrical tape here, okay? Same kind of grip as if you're peeling an apple. It's kind of hard to hold this. If you don't have large size hands, it's a really tough grip. It's not comfortable, okay? And you'll risk dropping the knife, okay? So that's something to consider, and for that reason I gave it a 4 out of 5. I docked it a point. Cutting, so cutting the edge and using of the knife, I give it a 4.25 out of 5. And it gets such a high rating because it really cuts through things really nice and fast, and it really digs in well with this S30V steel. But where it falls short, again, is in those tight cuts, when you're trying to cut something small and you don't have much room to work with, or where you have to get in, in precision cut. It's just, that's where it kind of suffers a little bit on those fine cuts because the edge gets so thick so fast, okay? If you compare that to the Valet here, look at the difference on the edge thickness there, how wide it gets, how fast. That's huge. And even if you compare it to the Delica, look how thin the Delica is. You look at the difference on the front. That's the Delica versus the Sage 3 right there, okay? So this just makes it a lot more difficult to get into those tight cuts. So that docks it 3/4 of a point. That puts it to 4.25. Maintenance, overall, this steel for S30V sharpens relatively easily, and that's because the edge is so very thin. And it doesn't take many passes on a fine stone to remove the steel to get a sharp edge again. Where it loses just a little bit of points is because it's a closed back design, so you don't have the easy maintenance of just blowing the lint out. You have to get in there with a Q-tip or a folded up piece of small paper towel. Plus it makes it a little bit more difficult to lubricate too, because I find that that bolt lock there wants to have a little bit of lubrication from time to time to keep it working nice and clean. So overall, I give the knife 18.75 out of 25. That gives it an overall rating of 75%. That compares to 86% with the 940-1 by Benchmade and the Valet by Benchmade at 74%. So, like I said, if it weren't for the way this knife was, for how wide it was, this would be a top-rated knife. It could possibly even be higher than the 940-1, except for not the handle, if it weren't for that handle. And so that brings it at 75%, which is still actually a very high rating. And that just goes to show how good this knife is. that it can bring that high of a rating with that low of a point on the carry portion right there. So that's my review of the Sage 3. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.